Hey everyone, in this video I want to dive into Entra Permissions Management, giving me the ability to get insight into the various permissions identities have, be it users or some application, understand which of those might be considered high risk, understand which of those are being used, getting great visibility into ongoing use and requirements around identities, but also enabling permissions on demand when, hey, I need to do something ad hoc and get more permissions. So this is what we're really going to focus on in this session. And this all comes from the fact that as we think about it, our use of the cloud is expanding. And we may be multi-cloud. So I can absolutely think about the idea that if we think of the three big clouds today, I could think about, hey, obviously there's Azure, which is something I focus on a lot. I can think about AWS. Oh, did that wrong. AWS and GCP. And we use these more and more for our key business applications. And as we use these multiple clouds more and more, it becomes difficult to track the actual permissions and requirements of the identities. Now, these identities can absolutely be people that are using one or more of the various clouds. But additionally, we find we have applications. And these applications, they have service principals, they have identities of their own that are also used against the various clouds. And we want to think about, well, what are the high-risk privileges? Who has these high-risk privileges? Do they actually need them? What are the permissions that they're using? I might get a permission at a certain scope. Well, do I need it at that scope? Or is it really just a subset of that I'm actually using? So we want to get this idea of understanding what are the permissions being used, and so what are the ones they really need? If you think about a typical user, I might have multiple roles over my career at a certain company. So my identity, for example, well, I start off with a certain list of permissions to a certain set of resources. Well, then I go to a different project, so I get some more permissions. Then I take a different role where I get some more permissions, and they just really keep mounting up. So my privileges are these ever-expanding lists. And very rarely do we take things away. And I may only actually be using this. So I have all of these other permissions just sitting around that might be high risk that obviously open me up to an exposure. It could be accidental. Hey, I do something accidentally, and with all these extra permissions, I can have a greater scope of damage. Or malicious. Either me directly, hey, I want to be mean, or someone compromises my identity, again, of a user or maybe some application. So any excess privilege just increases the chance of damage. So we really don't want that. So I want to think about, what do we actually need? What is the scope they're actually required at? I don't want any excessive permissions just left over. But we have to understand there are times I will need some extra permission. Sometimes it's part of my core role and I need it very frequently, but maybe it is ad hoc. Hey, I'm doing this thing that for this one-time occasion, I need an extra boost of permissions just for an hour. Well, how do we handle that? And how do I do it in a way that avoids the permission creep? I want to make sure I don't allocate it in a way that it adds to this ever-growing list of permissions that exposes me to greater risk. So I want to think about all of these things. And I'm going to demo a lot in Azure, because if you know me, obviously I focus on Azure. But realize the solution we're going to talk about applies equally across all of the clouds, be it Azure, AWS, GCP. It has the same sets of capabilities. So as I demo on Azure, keep in mind, hey, if I also have stuff in AWS, if I have stuff in GCP, or only those, doesn't matter, this equally applies to those. So if I want to solve this problem, if I want to solve the problem of too many permissions lying around or at a too great a scope, I need to understand, well, what are all of the resources across my clouds? I need to understand, well, what identities are at play, be it users or applications. What are the permissions that these various identities have across the various clouds? And then what are the ones they use? So based on observed interactions with the resources in the three clouds, what are the sets of permissions that they're actually using? With that, what are the excessive permissions? What are the high-risk permissions? How do I bring this back? How do I give them just enough to do the job? And then, hey, still enable permissions on demand when they need it. And as you're going to guess, because this video is based on Entra Permissions Management, what we're going to talk about for this as a solution is a permissions management solution. So we're going to focus on this idea of a cloud infrastructure entitlement management, a CIM system. So we have this idea of my CIM system, and this was an acquisition. So this was CloudKnox permissions management, but it is now part of the Entra family. Permissions management. So this is the solution that's really going to focus on solving all of this. It is multi-cloud. The whole point of this is it helps customers control the resources wherever they are across AWS, GCP, Azure. This is not any kind of, hey, it's better on Azure. This is not. This is equal across all of the different clouds. So what does it do? What is this solution actually going to give us? So think about those challenges that I talked about and what we need to do to solve the problem. The first thing we have to be able to do is obviously a discovery. So I have to discover, that's the first thing I need. And when we talk about discover, we're talking about discover what are the resources across the clouds that I'm using. I have to discover the identities, discover the permissions they have, discover what maybe are high-risk permissions that we've got. I need to understand all of those things. I need an activity-based authorization protocol. I need to understand the permissions being used. And then what I want to do, once I've done that discovery, is I want that least privilege. I don't want these extra permissions lying around. I don't want it at a higher scope than it needs to be. So what we then want to be able to do is automate least privilege. I want them, if we think about zero trust, if we think about all of the best practices, we have just enough to do the job we need to do. So I'm going to look at the history of what the identities, be it a user or application, actually does. They're the permissions I want them to have. So I want to bring that back in. I then want to be able to enable permissions on demand. There's always these times we want to do some elevation, and I don't want to just give them the role and then make a note, hey, make sure you revoke it. Even things like PIM may be seen as overkill. It's a lot of admin effort just for an ad hoc one-off thing. So I want some kind of workflow I can initiate to get the permissions when I actually want it. And then once I've done all of this, I want just an ongoing monitoring. I want the idea of monitoring those permission risks. So I don't get it in a fantastic state by going through these actions, then it all kind of falls apart over time, which is very common. We'll do some work, we'll do some solution, and then we don't take care of it. So we want this to help us actually solve that. So what's required to actually get this and have this solution in place? So we do need to onboard this Entra Permissions Management. Now to do this, I require an instance of Azure Active Directory. I do not need an Azure subscription, but I do require an Azure AD instance. So I can think about, okay, I have my Azure AD instance for my company. Again, I do not need any Azure subscriptions. That's nothing I worry about. I just need a tenant. I need a tenant because what we're going to have to do is I need to onboard. So I'm going to think about my onboarding. So we're going to onboard Entra Permissions Management. Now to do that onboarding, I need to be a global admin in that Azure Active Directory. It's going to create a few things. The big thing it's going to create, it's actually going to create an enterprise application for this cloud management. So we're going to see an app registration, and we can see it. If I super quickly jump over to my environment for a second. So I've already done the onboarding, obviously. But if I quickly go and look at my Azure AD, and I could see this a number of different ways, but if I actually look at my role assignments, one of the things it has to have at minimum is a reader. So I can see this cloud infrastructure entitlement management application. So it's an enterprise app that gets stood up in my Azure AD. And this is what's going to get used for some of the permissions to go and do that discovery in the other clouds. It's going to be used to onboard authorization systems and data collectors. Now, if we actually looked at my environment for a second, you'll see, yes, it has to have reader. I have to be able to go and see the things. But I've also given it this user access administrator role, which for Azure resources, lets it actually go and change things. And we'll come back to this in more detail, but it lets it do the right sizing exercise. It lets me enable permissions on demand without having to kind of run any scripts or other things as part of the activities. And that's really the onboarding. It goes and creates this application in the Azure AD. So again, this is all three clouds, but I just need an Azure AD instance, but I don't need any specific resources in Azure or any other cloud. So I have one instance of Entra Permissions Management per Azure AD tenant. And then for each cloud, I want to manage and do this permissions management, we need one or more data collectors. So depending on which clouds I'm using, I'm going to deploy data collectors. Now, the exact nature of this deployment and the permissions varies slightly between clouds. The documentation goes into very great detail on all of this. But the data collector has a unique ID. It's the configuration for it acting as a collector. For Azure, I would only ever need one collector. For AWS and GCP, I may need multiple collectors because AWS has organization accounts. G Suite has the G Suite organizations that may need different configuration parameters for the access. But again, the docs go through all of that. And then once I have the data collectors, we then add authorization systems to our entity. An authorization system is just a generic term for either an Azure subscription, an AWS account, or a GCP project. So that's all that is. So every Azure sub, for example, would be an authorization system. Every GCP project would be an authorization system. So if I had 1,000 AWS accounts, I would have 1,000 authorization systems. That's all that's doing. And I can see those. So again, if we jump over super quickly, in my very limited environment, so again, we have Microsoft Entra. That's this family of the solutions. Now I would click to go to permissions management. And then we go into the permissions management dashboard. So this is the starting dashboard. And we're going to come back to this. But if I think about my configuration, so my little settings gear up here, I can see, hey, it supports the 3 different data collectors across AWS, across Azure, across GCP, and I have already deployed a data collector for Azure. But no, I can just as easily create configurations to go and discover for AWS. And likewise, I could go and create it for GCP as well. And when I create these configurations, I can have details about, well, what should it actually go and discover? Should it go and get all of the authorization systems, either the accounts, the subs, the projects, or I can be more granular. And then in my case for Azure, I've discovered a single subscription. So again, I would see an authorization system. Again, authorization system is just a generic term because AWS and Azure and Google use different terms for their account subscription projects. So authorization system is the generic term for one of those things. So each instance would be an authorization system. So here we can see, hey, I have one authorization system known to my environment, but I could just as easily gather all of them. I really do have complete control on this. So I've onboarded this particular subscription. And what you can see straight away is it's gathered certain inventory about that particular authorization system, or in Azure terminology, subscription. So it's found some virtual machines, some database accounts, some network interfaces, some NSGs, some other things, sites, the list kind of goes on, but it's found a number of different things. And remember, what is our goal? What do we want to really achieve with this solution? Step one is really I want to understand what's excessive here. What are the permissions, be it humans or application, machine identities have that they don't really need? That's the thing I really want to get an idea of. So we think about this creep of our permissions. And so the big thing we see straight away that helps us get a really good idea of how bad are things. How bad is our overall environment? How bad are individual accounts? Is if we think about this whole list of permissions and then these ones I use, you can almost think about, well, there's this permission creep index. So based on the excessive permissions of each user, and then overall in my organization, we're going to get this permission creep index, which is a great way to quickly see how much excessive permissions do I have in my organization, and gives me an idea of, well, what's the trend of that, and gives me a starting point. So if I go and look over here, we start off in the dashboard, and you can really see from these tabs at the top, it is going to give us really a life cycle of what we're going to do. Hey, we get an idea of where we are. We have analytics to give us some more information. Hey, then I'm going to go and maybe fix certain things, remediate. Then I might want to put things in place to keep it automatically in a great way. So automatically maybe revoke certain privileges. Maybe want to go and do some deep investigation, forensics on accounts, and then get some reporting about what's going on. So we can step through the tabs to get a nice idea of, well, what's really happening in the environment and how do we solve this? So right now in my dashboard, I have this permission creep index, and you can see it goes, this little blue box is telling me where I am, and I'm in the red. So out of this index, I'm, well, pretty close to 100, so I'm not in a good way. I'm actually at 83. So on the right-hand side, you can see the trend of how it's gone, what my recent changes, and what my current PCI is. So I'm 83, which is not good. I have way too many permissions. And in it, that little blue circle, it's showing me, well, how many accounts are contributing to this. And I can see, well, okay, 24 identities. And out of those, I can see, well, 17 are high. They have a lot of excessive permissions, and 7 are low. They have extra permissions, but it's really not that bad. I can click on it. When I click on it, I then can go and see the detail. Okay, 9 high, 2 lower users. Then it's showing me applications. Okay, so users, I have 9 high, 8 medium. Applications, I can see I have 8 high, 4 low. And then managed identities, I just have 1 low. So it's understanding the types of identities I'm going to see in that particular type of cloud, so Azure. Again, I would get equivalents in AWS and GCP as well. It's showing me the detail of that PCI trend. And then also down the bottom, it has all of the findings. I can see findings around, hey, inactive apps, inactive users, super users, over-provisioned active users, over-provisioned active applications, inactive groups. And it's even showing me hey, I've got some blob containers that are accessible externally, so a point of risk. So it's showing me that, so I could maybe go and do something to, hey, I want to remediate that. And I can click on any of these. If I click on these, let's say over-provisioned active users, it will then dive into, hey, giving me the changes got 9, and I could click that, and it will open up a report showing me the detail of those 2 users. So here I can see, and this is now going into the reporting information, but I can see Clark Kent and John Saville. These are not good users. They're active and they have way too many permissions. And it gets even worse for me because it will then go ahead and show me how many permissions I'm using, how many permissions I am granted. So John Saville uses 81 permissions. I've been granted 12,250. I shall go and bow my head in shame. But it shows me when I was last active, date created, and it gives me the PCI score for those. So it's giving me straight away some really nice information about what are the most at risk. I could see my system identities. I could go and see my serverless functions. But it's giving me this detail. And we're going to come back to the reporting to actually go and start doing something meaningful about it. So this is the key point here. If I click the little back arrow up here, I can get back to that overall PCI. So I can see super quickly, I'm not in a great place. If we went and looked back at this, therefore, it's showing me that PCI across my whole organization is very much in the red, and it's showing me the number of accounts that are contributing to that. Obviously, the bigger the company, I have a very small environment, so 24 accounts is a lot of my accounts. So if I was seeing that in my environment, I go, okay, I got some work to do. I really want to go and remediate that. So I need to think about, well, I need more information about those things. So I want to go into an analytics mode. So I'm still doing my discovery. It has gone in. Once I did the onboarding and I set up the data collectors, it went through the different authorization systems across all of the clouds that I'm using, and it's brought up this PCI index. Now I want to go and get some more information. So I'm going to go and look at the analytics. So now obviously the analytics tab, I'm continuing my journey. And once again, that's giving me that information on the different types of identities. I'm currently looking at Azure because that's the only cloud I have, but notice I'd be able to do the same thing. I could change clouds. I can change authorization systems that are in scope. Again, I only have one subscription, and you can organize these. If this was a bigger environment with lots of accounts or projects or subscriptions, I can create a folder hierarchy to organize them. So I have complete control. Maybe I'd have a dev test and a production, however I want to do that to make this experience even simpler. I can look at the different types of identities. Right now I'm looking at users. I can pick the different types of identities. I can pick the identity state. Is it active or inactive? I could look at just show me risky. I can look at only high-risk tasks. So it understands what would be considered a high-risk task, and I can go and apply this to it. And then I'm getting the detail about these. So maybe I just want to see service principals. Well, I could go and see the service principals that have high-risk tasks. If I go back to users for a second, I could go and click on one of these, and it's showing me the details of those tasks. So we can see here, hey, unused groups of tasks out of the 4,075, I'm using one, Microsoft.authorization. So we could expand that, and you'll see in the authorization, notice it's gray because I am using at least a part of it. And then over here, I can expand it out to see exactly which one I am using. So I'm getting all of this amazing detail that I have. I can see the groups I'm in. I can see the different roles I have and how were they assigned. Okay, so these are all permanent roles. And how were they assigned to me? It was given to me directly. It was given to me because I'm part of a certain group. So it gives me this fantastic visibility. Again, these are now analytics to see what's going on. So that's a huge step to be able to solve things. But now I want to actually fix it. So now we move over to remediation. And once again, we have a whole set of different tabs available to us here. And a key point of what's happening, there are a lot of built-in roles in both Azure and Google Cloud and AWS. And it absolutely may include the permissions that we need, but it may include others as well. And there are going to be times where those others as well, we don't want. So we can think about, well, we want to create a custom role that only has the specific permissions they actually have to do the job. Maybe I'm being given it at a scope that's excessive. So when we think about solving this, as part of this least privilege and automation, hey, I may have privileges because I've got a bunch of roles. Well, maybe I shouldn't have those roles. Maybe a custom role that really focuses just on the permissions that it's observing me using is key. Now, you do want to be careful with this. If users perform tasks and they've not performed those tasks, or an application has not performed the task during the visibility window, it's going to say, hey, you don't use this. So there are going to be times where if you know if there's some seasonality of permissions use, you want to be careful about reining those in, especially on applications where you may break some piece of functionality. So you want to be careful with this, but go through the analytics will give you some insight into, hey, exactly what is being done. So for my remediation, I want to make those changes. Maybe it's creating custom roles based on what those specific users groups actually do. So I can see the roles over here. These are custom roles that I have added to Azure in this case, but I would also be able to go and see a whole bunch of all the system things that are built into this particular authorization system, Azure. Again, same on AWS and GCP. I like the permissions tab. So the permissions tab lets me say, okay, well, let's try and see some specifics. So maybe I want to look at inactive users and they have any permissions creep index. Or maybe I want to look at ones that are granted or unused, for example. So unused task for inactive users. And now I can see a bunch of users. So these users are inactive and they have unused tasks. So I could go and select a couple of users. And now it's showing me specifics across those users. And what you'll see on the right-hand side is we have things we could do. I could add roles, add tasks, remove tasks, and then quick actions. Revoke unused tasks, revoke high-risk tasks, revoke delete tasks, assign read-only status. This will actually go and remediate just with a quick click by creating some custom role to replace. So I would select the particular role for this filtered down user I've selected. So maybe instead of network contributor, if I clicked this one, or I could select multiple. So first thing I did, remember, which users do I care about? And then that filtered it down to show me specific roles it can act on in this results area. So I might say, oh, these ones here. And then I could hit a quick action. Revoke unused, revoke high risk. Now if I click one of these, I can either execute, which will just do it based on the permission that the Entra Permissions Management has, or it could generate a script that I would then execute to perform the items. There are two modes that Entra can run in, and this really depends on the permissions I gave it. So there is a controller mode. So if I go back for a second super quickly, notice my controller status is enabled. It's enabled because remember I gave the application that it created that user access administrator. If it only had read permission, I didn't give it that other role, this would be disabled. So the only options it would ever be giving me is to generate scripts. I also wouldn't be able to do permissions on demand I'm about to show. So because this controller status is enabled, it doesn't have to just generate a script. I can just say, well, go and do that for me. So I have that ability to do those various things. But hey, once again, I can select the users, I could select multiple users, I could select lots of roles, and then, hey, I could do quick actions to quickly right size those particular permissions. So that's what this is doing. Now realize there are a small latency for those new settings to actually go and propagate through. So it's just not going to be instant, but it will now go and, hey, I can revoke those unused tasks. I can remove those high risk tasks, revoke, deleted type tasks, assign read only, or hey, I want to go and be more specific around adding roles, removing roles, whatever I want to do. There's also an idea of templates. If I think about in Azure, for example, but again, AWS and Google Cloud do exactly the same thing, there are built-in roles. And those roles are really just made up of lots of permissions. Maybe I don't want to go and create a whole bunch of custom roles in AWS or Google Cloud or Azure. Well, I can just create them in here. I can create a template of a set of permissions that I want users to be able to either I assign as part of some of these tasks, or they might want to do permissions on demand and go and request it. So these templates are just doing that. I can say, hey, I want to create a new template. I'll give it a name. I'm just going to say blob, but I may not stick to that. And then I can go and see all of the different permissions by, in Azure's case, resource provider, and I can just go and add them. So I'm making up a list of tasks, permissions in Azure terminology, that I want this template to have. And I'm just going to cancel that. And I created one already. So again, these are just specific lists of permissions. Now, as we think about this and this whole right sizing, yes, there are other tools available to us. In an Azure world, there are things like access reviews, where the user self-reviews or some delegated person or their manager checks, should I have this role, or should I have this app access, or should I be a member of this group? But you're relying on a human being to check that. And do they really know? They have no real concept of, hey, yes, I have this thing. Is it way too much? Whereas this is doing a very different thing under the covers. But additionally, what I can do here is if we think about this idea of these privileges, there are times I need a bit more. I want permissions on demand. And I can do that from here as well. So in this remediation, I can also put in a request, and then I can approve requests. Now, I as John, if I look for a second at user management, I could give certain roles to groups, but as a user John, you can see I'm an admin. So I can view, control, approve all permissions. I have all of that. Whereas Clark, who's the demo user we're going to do, they don't have those permissions. They can literally just, hey, say, I want to request something, please. Also, as part of this demo for remediation, if I go to settings and request settings, firstly, you can set a maximum number of hours that I could request permissions on demand for. And also, I have turned off one-time passcode. If you didn't turn this off, what would happen is when I try and request something, before I can submit the request, it would email me a one-time passcode. And as a reviewer, before I could approve or do anything, it would email me a one-time passcode. Now I've turned those off just to clean up the demo, but I will show what that would look like as we go through this. So for this demonstration, let's look at Clark. So Clark is a contributor, network contributor, and reader. But Clark is doing something super, super important. Lex Luthor's up to no good. So Clark needs some additional permissions. Now, Clark is in the console. Notice Clark doesn't have the other tabs. Clark only has remediation and only has my requests. But Clark can put in a new request. The only authorization system types are Azure because I've not onboarded Google or AWS, but they would show as well. hey, I can see all the authorization systems under that cloud. Remember, generic term, account, project, subscription. So I see the subscription. I can do it on behalf of other people. Clark can't. Clark can only do it as themselves. If I went back to John for a second and went to my requests and did a request, I can see, hey, I've got my different identities over there, and sometimes I get other ones show up as well. So back to Clark. What do I want to request? I can request a role. So if I request a role, that's just a regular built-in role. Or I could request specific tasks, so not even a whole role, just specific things. Or I could request tasks that have already been kind of pre-created in Entra Permissions Management templates to save me manually entering the tasks. So I'm going to start off just requesting a role, and I'm going to say owner. So we scroll down, see owner, I'm going to add. Notice I could add multiple ones. So I'm just sticking the role and clicking the little add icon. Once it's added, I could do remove. And I'm going to click next. And I can request the information. Need to change permissions, because owner obviously can change permissions. I could put some notes. Do I want it straight away? Do I want it starting at a certain time? Do I want it on some recurrence? I have all of these options available. But I want it straight away, and actually I only need it for 1 hour. I want to be a good steward of my permissions. The scope, remember when I selected it, I did it at the subscription level, but I just as easily could have changed that. I could go to a particular resource group. I could go to a particular resource. So I have complete control of that. So I'm going to keep it at the subscription level, but I can change the scope and submit. Now again, I didn't get any emails, but just to show you, the first time I did this, I did have the emails turned on. And as a user, you would get various pop-ups around, hey, here's your one-time passcode. So you can see it submitted my request. As the user, I'm getting that email. And it would typically take a few minutes once it's approved, but I have to approve it. So now as the administrator, now I also will get emails. Now this is an example of the one-time passcode, and I thought it was brilliant because it was sup. But now as the administrator, I need to go and approve it. So if I go back in to my console, let's cancel that, and look at requests, here's the request. I could click on it to go and get the details of exactly what's being requested from here. But I can just hit approve or reject. So in this case, I'm going to hit approve. I could add a note. I'm just going to hit approve in this case. So that's successfully approved. So again, it's going to take a few minutes. While we're waiting the few minutes, let's also show, so you can see it's been approved, but I've not got the activated yet. So I'll get another email a few minutes later that will actually show me it's been activated. But while you're waiting for that, let's do another request. So we'll do Azure again. We'll do a subscription again. We'll do me again. This time we're going to request some specific tasks. So I don't want to request a whole role. I don't need it. I just need to do a couple of things from API management, for example. And I'm just going to make some things up here. Next, just API management, and hit submit. So now I've got a second request. Now this time, remember, it's just for those particular tasks. And I can see my approved one is in there as well. And I can see my pending. Notice that approved one is currently in activating status. That's still going through. Back as John, I need to approve that request. So if I reload again, there it is, and I'll hit approve. So now that will go through. And again, that's going to take a couple of minutes. And I can see all of the ones I've approved. I can see, hey, it's activating still, it's inactive. There'll be some emails, hey, you've approved requests. So I, as the administrator, get an audit track. So I would say, wait, I didn't approve that. I can see everything that's going on. As the user, they're also going to be getting, hey, your request has been submitted, your request has been approved, but I don't have any activated yet. So none of these permissions have actually taken effect. If I go back to the Azure portal, and let's say refresh. So, okay, so literally it's just come through. So now we can see it. Owner, Clark Kent. So I've now been given that permission. If I go and look at my Entra Permissions Management, it still shows, again, it's about 3 minutes from what I've seen in my demos, but very shortly, the user will actually get the email. And that Clark is obviously an owner. So Clark could completely go through now and start doing things as owner on that subscription. And they're going to get the email and all good for that 1 hour period. At what point it will then be taken away. So that's the whole idea. Now you may wonder, well, how does it give particular tasks? Because Azure doesn't work that way. And AWS and Google Cloud, well, they don't really like to work that way. We like roles. So what it's going to do behind the scenes, when I request either via a template or via just those specific tasks directly, what it's actually going to do is create a temporary custom role in the subscription. It will then give it to the user and then we'll revoke it and delete it once that has actually passed. So if we reload again, so we're still activating. Let's go and look at what permissions Clark currently has. So still 4. So those custom ones have not hit yet because we would see this. But through the miracle of editing, I will speed this up. Okay, so I've hit refresh. And actually, it didn't work the first time. Again, it's the miracle of editing. But you'll see I've got this extra role. So just so I'm completely transparent, I have seen this happen once before. So that initial request I made of the user didn't work. It just went straight to deactivated. So they never got that permission. So I then submitted a second request with just another list of tasks, and I approved it. And this time it worked. So I don't quite know what happened. It's the demo gods angry at me. But we can now see I've got this test for automation. This is the new one I did rather than waste your time just clicking the same buttons again. This was for 7 tasks. And we can see it's activating. Whereas that initial one I did just went to processed. It never actually went through. And I did get an email to that fact. Again, it told me. It said, hey, it's been deactivated. So I submitted a new one and then I approved it. And the interesting part here is, so behind the scenes, I was given a new role. This CK, CloudKnox, his old name, P.O.D, permissions on demand, the user, and then this value. And this role that it created, notice it was done at the scope. The role has the permissions I added. I clicked 7 tasks, it's added those 7 to it. And it even tells you, hey, created by CloudKnox. I'm sure they'll update that to say on Entra at some point in the future. But that's how it's working behind the scenes. So it goes and creates a custom role with just those tasks. And again, I'm showing it on Azure. AWS, Google Cloud would do exactly the same thing. But now user Clark can go and use those new sets of permissions, both owner and the specific ones I added in. And I can always check the status. So if I go and look at all requests, I can see the ones I've approved. I can see the ones that have processed, completed. As the end user, well, I can also go and check at ones that are approved, that are currently active. And I can see, hey, I have 54 minutes left on this one. And this will update pretty quick. And I can see ones that I've had in the past. So I can see all of those done and when I used them and when it started, all of that information. I can see information about the requests. So that's the permissions on demand. That's giving me permissions just when I need them. And again, as the user, I get that full email trail of everything I'm doing and the admins get it again. And now I'm saying, hey, look, this other request was activated for those 7 permissions. So there's a nice chain. Nothing's really sneaking past me. I can see everything that is going on. Now you may, at this point, wonder. You're saying, okay, you talked about roles and you talked about permissions on demand, but also, for example, Azure AD has PIM, Privileged Identity Management. How do these things play together? So if I was to think about it, as a user, we probably have a base set of roles. So I have a base set of roles that are very, very minimal, that I just have there all the time. They're just standing permissions. And then there are going to be permissions that I routinely need. So I could think about, well, common elevation. As part of my job, I often need to become a contributor on this resource group or this account or this project to do things with databases or whatever that might be. So for those more common elevations planned just in time, well, this is where, in an Azure world, I could use PIM. So the Azure Active Directory Privileged Identity Management. Remember, with PIM, it shows me what's available to me. So it's something the administrator has gone into in advance. If I quickly was to jump over, I can see what are my roles. It's something that I use a lot. So the administrator has pre-assigned me the ability to activate and use this role. So PIM, and again, PIM is for Azure. That's specific to Azure. It's not going to work on AWS or Google Cloud. So it would mean I would need a different solution for other clouds. But that's how they could play together. Hey, I might use PIM for those common elevations. But what about when it is that ad hoc? It's some ad hoc request that I don't want to have PIM have to go through and set up, or it's just those few tasks. Or I want something that just works across all of the clouds. This is where the permissions on demand. That's what that solves. So they can play together. I have a base set of roles all the time. In an Azure world, I might use PIM for things I commonly elevate up and are shown to me and available to me. And then the permissions on demand via the Entra Permissions Management is the ad hoc. It's the out of those ordinary permissions I have where I want to do something else. There are even auto approvals for AWS. So right now I talked about I had to go and approve that request. For AWS, there are auto approvals, but also realize in many ways this is an engine. It's an engine that, yes, has its own console I can use. But if I had my own ITSM, I could hook into this through my ITSM. And then in the ITSM, I could have approval logic. I might have automatic workflow. So there's many different things I could actually do with this. So at this point, if you think about what we've done with the Remediate tab, hey, we've gone through this. We've identified those extra permissions, extra scopes or resources we're not accessing, brought them back. And hey, I've still enabled this ad hoc through the on-demand. Now I want to keep it. I want to keep it healthy. So some of the things we can have is there's something called Autopilot. That's not the Windows Autopilot. So what Autopilot lets us do is I can create rules to automatically, for example, remove unused permissions. If I go to Autopilot at the top, I could go and create a new rule. And for Azure, for example, I've got this remove permissions for unused apps managed identities. So I could say, hey, remove, select that. Which subscriptions? How many days do I want it unused for? On demand. These are generated and applied manually, and hit save. So these are being built up as we speak. But the whole point of these is they will keep the environment in that nice, healthy state you've got it to. We have audit. This is deep inspection. For example, I want to look at high risk activities. So I create queries. So here it's starting me off, hey, in the last day. But then I can obviously go and add to this. So if I do add, I might say, hey, and the stay is authorization failure, and the resource task name is any of the different tasks I want to manage. So I can basically create these queries to go and inspect based on all of the discovery it's doing to find these. And I can save this query. And then I'd have access to save queries up here. And so I can run it over and over again. We have reporting. So we already saw some of the reporting when we just went through, but we have deep analytics via the reports. One of the fantastic ones, and again, look, AWS user role audits, PCI history, user entitlements. I like the permissions analytics report just because it's fun. But here I could go and look at things like, hey, over-provisioned active identities. And it shows me that whole permissions used, permissions granted. I can look at who are my super users. Okay, I could go and see those permissions used, granted, what they're doing with the various things. So it gives me that ability, and I can drill down into the deep detail on all of these as I showed already to understand exactly what my permission standpoint is. And if you think about exposure, if you think about risk of the environment, it's all about identities having too many permissions or permissions at a high scope that it doesn't need. So this is all about securing the user, securing the applications, so they have the minimal required, but to be productive. So this is telling me that, because often we have no idea. How do I really know what roles I need to do the job? How do I really know what exact tasks this application needs to work? I don't know. So we give it a role that is nearly always over, but we think it's fine. But there's that buffer amount that's just additional risk. This removes all of that. This tells me exactly what it needs, and then through that remediation, we'll right size it. Then we have a little bell icon up here. The little bell icon lets me create notifications. Hey, a notification for the first time. So let's do it for Azure. The first time someone accesses something. So the state is a success, and the task name, I can take a certain task, or I could have resource type. So I can go and create these. So this was for activity. If I change it to role-based anomaly, then I get, hey, any resource access for the first time. Identity performs a particular task for the first time. Again, across AWS, across Azure, across Google Cloud. There's statistical anomalies. Identity performed tasks with unusual patterns. So it's now using machine learning, again, through all of the different clouds. And it will alert me. I can create these alerts for all of these different things. And likewise, permissions analytics. Active groups, things on S3, EC2 instances with access to configure percentage of S3 buckets. Obviously, Google Cloud. This will differ by the clouds because they have different things. But it's, again, tuned around the 3 clouds. So it's going to give the information that's pertinent to those particular clouds. So that's really the key point around this. So that was it. I mean, that's really what I wanted to show as part of this. Now, from a licensing perspective, it's licensed by resource per year. I mean, it's basically $125 per managed resource per year. That includes compute resources, container clusters, serverless functions, databases across AWS, Azure, Google Cloud. It does monitor other things as well. It just doesn't bill you for those. And you can always check what licenses you need. If you go back to those settings under licensing, it will show you. So here, based on what it discovered, compute, serverless, compute containers, databases, I should have 12 licenses. So that's how it's licensed. It's based on, and it's actually billed, I think, monthly, and there's some rounding things going on there. The billing site goes into the exact detail of exactly how it's billed. So it's $10.40 per resource month. But that's the focus around this. It's really built around the resources being licensed. So I hope that helped. Hopefully it gives you the idea that it's all about, hey, discovering the resources I have over the 3 big clouds, understanding the identities, be it a user or an application, understand what they have, understand what they're using, right-sizing it, and hey, as required, I can do those permissions on demand. I have that deep insight, I have that deep analytics, I have that fantastic reporting. There is a 90-day trial. So if you want to go and play with it, there's a 90-day trial, so you can go and spin that up and have a go. But as always, a lot of work goes into creating these, so hey, a like and subscribe is appreciated. But until next video, take care.